to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Now today, we've got a special treat. We are talking to a behavioural economist, and not just anyone, one that's regularly on ABC and Channel 9 and Channel 7 and all the TV shows when we need to know what's happening in the economy and how consumer behaviour is influencing the economy or vice versa. So today it's a pleasure to be joined with evanlucas, and we have a chat to him about the state of the Australian economy and how that feeds into property. I ask him about the future of Australian property and what needs to be done to deal with some of these affordability constraints. I ask him how we actually got to this rental affordability crisis and ways in which investor and consumer behaviour interplays and changes the economics of the world that we live in. It's an awesome interview with Evan, who's a very, very clever and gifted communicator. I'm sure you're going to get something out of this one. Here's Evan. Evanlucas, thanks for joining me on Geared for Growth.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I've been looking forward to this for now 3 or 4 months since we met. It's going to be, knowing how we spoke on that day, this is going to be a very big wax lyrical thing. You and I have big thought processes and lots of in-depth sort of questioning. So super excited for this. So thank you so much for having me on.
No, it's a pleasure. And hopefully that has people not turning the dial or whatever the modern equivalent is. Because we first met at the Property Investment Professionals Association National Congress, where you spoke and you absolutely smashed it out of the park.
Oh, thank you.
And for anyone that's listening, Evan is a behavioural economist. I would say he's TV's Evanlucas, actually. We used to describe people as it's TV's Evanlucas. TV. You've done a lot with ABC and Channel 7 and 9 and all those sorts of things. But from the beginning, behavioural economists I first sort of got an insight into the genre with the Freakonomics guys. I mean, those two books sort of taught me a lot about incentives is probably the biggest one. And you put an incentive somewhere and then human behavior finds a way to chase it or disproportionately behaves in a way that kind of benefits themselves. Is that the best way to describe behavioral economics, or presumably there's something better?
Yes, there probably is. I mean, the great sort of Daniel Kahneman, who unfortunately left us last year after an incredible career, probably one of the most famous economists of all time. Yeah, he wasn't an economist; he was a psychologist, and he is probably the one that would put it down to more the idea that all human behavior is driven by want and desire and all those kinds of things. It's really basic. So I need to also put that out there. When you hear that, it's quite confronting because it sounds really primal. Like, that's probably the way to also say that to you, in the fact that, are primal basic instincts still the driver of Homo sapiens? Yeah. I mean, again, you've got to be honest with yourself about that. The difference is that we now have higher level thought and we have higher level being and thinking and blah, blah, blah. That's a whole philosophical question for a completely different audience and podcast. But it needs to be put back into the context of what you and I do and how we work, and what we do is that's okay. So behavioral economics just embraces the concept that human beings are aspirational beings. Human beings think on an aspirational basis. We, like most, organisms on this planet, are trying to basically strive to, be something else. Live is one way of really primal, basically putting it. But more importantly than that, it's about understanding that we have control about our wants, desires, our future, our goals, aspiration. So the way I always sort of come back to it, the way I describe it, is that human beings want one thing that all, not just behavioral economics, but psychological, psychiatric testing will tell you, is that we want autonomy, the ability to have a self-chosen, self-determined destiny. And if you put that into, particularly in what you and I work in, and the the property world, there is nothing more self-determining than property, because property has not just the investment connotation if you're an investor in property, not just a homeowner connotation if you're a homeowner. It's actually a big form of stage of life movement as well. Like, there is a psychological behind to it, is going that I'm at a point in my life, whether it's starting, some people are starting as young as 12, or more likely you're starting in your late teens, early 20s. These days, it's more likely you're early 30s. With the way that the market's now moving, whatever time it is, it doesn't matter. It's more about the fact that it is all wrapped up in that aspirational, movement that human beings want.
That's an interesting point. You're sort of referencing what I would sort of call the lizard brain human or the Neanderthal. But I mean, I've heard commentators say, like, the moment we use, say, contraception, we're breaking Darwin's laws, right? Because that is kind of putting a barrier in what was traditionally the way that, genes were passed on, because we would have these desires to be with a person, and the intended or unintended consequence of that could be offspring, and that are sort of built in your model. But of course, we've now got a tremendous amount of choice. We've got a tremendous amount of technology to be able to leverage. But yeah, it's interesting to note that autonomy is number one, because you look at your average person. Is a 5% of us having that degree of agency and autonomy that we actually want? It seems like a low number, right?
So it does. And again, the definition of what autonomy is will be different to everybody out there listening. So financial autonomy is what I love to talk about. Financial autonomy is completely different for every individual person. That does not mean minted. It does not mean you have to be rich.
Right.
It is, the way I define it is that if you have the ability to do what you want, when you want, how you want, that is financial autonomy. If your money allows you to take a couple of weeks off here and there to do the things that you love, or that 1 week a year, 2 weeks a year of a holiday, or the spending time with your family more than actually being at work, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter what goal, definition, aspiration you assign to it. That, I would argue, is financial autonomy. So again, getting back to the other thing that you've highlighted there, which I loved listening to, was the word choice, right? So human beings have been told, particularly in the postmodernist world, that choice is what you want. Choice is everything, blah, blah, blah. And that's fair. The thing about choice from a human behavior perspective is that we don't like it, because choice is actually something you have to stop, think, and react. We are geared to basically automate our lives. I mean, ChatGPT, there's a reason why we're loving AI at the moment, is because it's automating our lives even more. So, why am I'm sitting here talking to you right now? Why do I always drink a latte? It's just because what I do. Why do I always choose a blue pen over a black pen? Why do I walk to the train station rather than ride? They are choices that I innately have made every day that I don't even think about, I just do. And so choice is that. The other thing that's interesting about that, going even broader and back into the property world, you talked about procreation and the changes of that, and procreation, contraception's been around for millennia, right? There are signs that the Egyptians had contraception, as far back as their times, with, homemade condoms, etc.
Yeah. The reusable ones wash out. Those are my favourites.
It's so fantastic.
From the trenches of World War I, where sometimes they write little love letters on them.
On all of those kind of things. What's really interesting now is also part of where property comes into it, is the rise of living with each other before you get married. And all that material. And so this, again, also gets back to that discussion at the moment, particularly around rent and rentals, because rentals are predominantly sort of run by single or newly coupled younger persons.
Yep.
And they're the ones right now sort of well and truly screwing out, because the new behavioral cultural change is to actually test the relationship. Right? Live with each other, see how it works. Can you actually live with each other? Having that proximity to somebody for such a long period of time. And then, marriage talks about the whole idea of doing it, inverted commas, forever. That's also what's come into the property world that I think is the behavior economics comes as well, is that they now know that the other part of that discussion is not just the rental, is that because of affordability, you probably need to be a pair rather than a single, more so than ever, to actually also buy a property. I mean, you think back in the 50s and the incredibly sexist ways that it was, they wouldn't talk to the woman about getting the loan. It would always be to the man.
Yeah.
The man always, again, thankfully that's broken down. The caveat to it is that property is now at a level that it is requiring two people to actually acquire it rather than one. And that is a cultural phenomenon that has influenced the behavior that has now led to a really interesting economics conundrum, which is that you have to make lots of trade-offs, not choices, trade-offs. Do I continue to work longer so I can get the deposit and go on my own? Do we as a couple have to work longer and harder to get that dream home rather than in our 20s, which they were doing even as late as the late 90s, to now do it in our 30s? These are the trade-offs, push-pulls that we now find ourselves in economics because of the behaviour that we have as a society, particularly in Australia.
I want to go further into the housing crisis, but if we can sort of rewind a little bit further, and it gives me an opportunity to throw shade at you and your entire profession, which energizes me. It's my latte of the morning. Economists are sort of held in relatively low regard by property investors because, I mean, they're sort of equated to the weather person, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about the predictions during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, it seemed like the big four banks and their band of merry economists were saying 30% price falls, and then we saw a huge boom. It just sort of begs the question, are these economists working in models where they're assuming that people are behaving rationally, and that is actually a problem where maybe behavioural economics can bridge the gap?
So in defense of pure economic profession, what was interesting about that quote, particularly from the one you're looking at there, is the CBA report that came out in March 2020. The media picked up scenario 4. So they had 5 scenarios. Scenario 4 was scorched earth.
Right.
And that was the one where property prices basically plunged by 30%. Property crashes forever, blah, blah, blah. And if you read it, it was scorched earth. Like some seriously horrible things had to happen. But the media was like, property is going to fall by 30%. And I work in the media. You just talked about it before. I work in it. And I remember walking in to, production rooms going, guys, that you guys went to school. You can read. That's not what that said. But that's not what they hear, because not only that, again, the behavior side of it, human beings are geared towards loss aversion. Getting back to Daniel Kahneman. So that freaks them out. How do you get clickbait? Tell them that they're going to lose. So that's first thing. Why they are wrong? There are more mistakes in an Excel spreadsheet than any human being will ever make. And I think that needs to be pointed. I mean, I've come from an analytical world background. My starting point was not just economics, but I worked in analytics, waterfall data, spent my life buried in Excel spreadsheets, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, and I would never go back to it again. And it makes mistakes constantly because the assumptions are based on human thought that then go through a computer system that has been inputted by humans. It's better now with AI, but it still doesn't matter, because as soon as your assumptions are wrong, the whole thing's wrong.
Right.
And so from that point, the next thing to look at is that a lot of them will assume that their model is always right. And it's not just in property, it's across the analytical board in markets in general. Look at bond markets, look at equity markets. You listen to these boffins that sit at investment banks and what have you, and they will tell you that their models is flawless. Why, therefore, do they not A, outperform the market, and B, not sitting in the Bahamas, basically enjoying an early retirement? Because they don't work. So the behavior part of me, where it comes back to this, is that it forgets 2 things. First one, you heard me talk about at the Pippa event, which was time, and I'll come back to that. Time, you cannot stop time. Time is always moving. And even in COVID, people's life progression did not stop. The second one is an Australian-centric point of view. And the Australian-centric point of view is we, since the 1940s, have urbanized faster than any other developed world in terms of where we want to live. And in terms of our demand, supply of it has been anemic. So we went from having a population divide of about 60 to 65% urban to 40, 35, whatever number you want to take in rural. It's now about 90% urban, 10% rural.
Yep.
And we haven't built a huge amount of houses to offset that.
No. So
immediately supply, you can hear from that question, hasn't moved. Demand in the cities through the roof over the last 45, 50 years. In fact, sorry, it's more than that, 65 years. that's an Australian-centric thing. We want to do something that most other nations don't do. The more money we make, the closer we want to live to where we work. So you look in Melbourne, 8K ring. You look in Sydney, 12K ring. Brisbane, 6K ring. Blah, blah, blah. Whatever you want to call them. The closer and closer to the CBDs or to the hubs of high-end work, the richer the housing property market is. If you look in London, Frankfurt, Paris, New York, take your pick, the richer they get, the further they move out. Because they've got better infrastructure, but they're also happy to commute. So New York, Manhattan, nobody lives in Manhattan that has that kind of money. They might have an apartment that they might sort of transit in for the day or the week that they work, but they live in Westchester or they live out in Long Island. You look at London, they live out in Kent, or they'll live out in East and West Sussex, or they'll live out on the outer parts of Greater London on a mansion, and then catch a train in. We don't do that.
Is that because the infrastructure system is better developed and better planned? Because
they've had time to do it, right?
Yeah, true. And I suppose if you contrast, say, Australia to the US, US has a lot of very major cities sort of dotted around the place, right? Whereas we've got Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, they're not at the same level. It's like that narrow little coastal strip where the majority of us live. If you turn the lights off and put Australia into dark and you see the lights of where people live, it's a tiny little strip, right? Is that part of the functional problem where we haven't done, like Canberra times 10? Like obviously Canberra was a planned city, it was a paddock, and it was kind of a stoush between where the capital should be. And we're like, oh, well, if we can't agree, we'll just build a bloody thing. But there's a fairly strong argument to say, well, that was better for house prices for Sydney and Melbourne because it's taken that demand somewhere else. And, but Canberra has great prices.
Yeah, but most of it, Canberra prices are insane.
Yeah, well, I mean to say, Canberra prices are very, very high.
Yeah,
but
you look at Adelaide, you look at Melbourne, you look at Adelaide was a completely planned property. Colonel Light sat on a hill in Adelaide, put his finger down there, drew up the city, drew the planning, blah, blah, blah. That was in 1836. And that's where I'm from, Melbourne, where I currently live, 1834. Similar thing, drawn up by the guys. Sydney, realistically, in this country is the only one that was basically not planned because it was free-for-all, convict explosion, et cetera, et cetera. Getting back to your point about that, turning the lights off, it's a great thing. We have to remember Australia as a country, landmass, sixth largest landmass on the planet. We have 27 million people in this country, which is the equivalent of Greater New York. We have a massive abundance of space with a really tiny population compared to globally. Again, let's look at the UK. England has 56 million, Scotland 12, Wales about 3. I think it all totals about 71, 74 million people in the Greater UK, and that entire country fits into the state of Victoria.
Right. I'll guess Queensland, but Victoria's even smaller.
Right. So the state of Victoria fits the entire of England, and just Wales pops into New South Wales. Right. It fits 3 times into South Australia. It fits something like 9 times or 12 times into Western Australia, let alone the rest of the country. And that's what's lost on this debate as well, is that when we hear about housing and all this debate and where it is, there's no one market in Australia. I will always point that out. The Australian market is the Adelaide market, the Melbourne market, the Brisbane market, the Sunshine Coast market, because everybody has different demands in there. But there is a fundamental behavioural cultural truth in this country that we are a nation that wants to live where we work, and our infrastructure over the 200 plus years that this country has been colonized by, Europe, has always sort of built big houses near where they work. I mean, again, we just haven't changed them. So you look at a Vaucluse in Sydney and Piper Point and a Manly. You look at the demand that's come from those areas. Yes, it's got denser, but at the same time, the traditional houses are still there. You look at Toorak, same thing. The traditional houses are still there. South Melbourne, same thing. You look into the eastern suburbs of Adelaide. You look into, the inner parts of South Brisbane, all of those kinds of places that were first formed. They are still the demand areas. And again, the great term NIMBY has demanded that has also happened. The fact that, local councils have pressure from the idea that not in my backyard. And all of those pressures come together to create a perfect, first of all, cultural thing that then folds into the behavior thing that's created the economics that we now have, which is that supply is and has been lower than it should be. You've got time culture, and I didn't talk about time. We'll come back to that again in a minute. But if you look at, this current debate online around baby boomers versus millennials, realistically, I'd actually say it's baby boomers versus young millennials / Gen Zers. Happens all the time in terms of generations blaming the generations above them. What I would argue is that at the moment, the reason baby boomers are living in the houses they've had for 20, 30, 40 years, where are they going?
Yeah.
Because that house doesn't exist, right? If they're downsizing, they want to still stay in the areas where their friends have lived for 30, 40 years. That house, that townhouse, that apartment, more likely than not, doesn't exist. And so they just stay put. So you then have, and this is where I will answer the time. Time doesn't stop, as I said before. Your transition we spoke about it, from being a single to a partner to a possible, small family to a medium family to a large family. The time that comes with that governs that you're going to need more space, right? You're going to need kid bedrooms, maybe 1, 2. The houses that your parents and your grandparents would have bought, they're not coming on the market because they're still in it, because they don't get the lifestyle that they want to keep that they've had for the last 30 years. So there might be 10 families demanding for the one property that does come up. And that, again, that's the economics, right? So demand 10, supply 1, price is high.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's the issue that we have with the household formation rate at the moment.
Yeah.
And we've got that stereotypical little old lady in the 4-bedroom house. It's like, well, where does she go?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, I'm going to use case in point. If you're watching us online at the moment, the house that I'm sitting in while we do this discussion, where does she go? Unfortunately, she passed away at 95.
Right.
And it's the only way we're getting access to it now as well, is that estate houses are that thing. And the difference also, let's go back in the time as well, when I sort of talked about the 80s and 90s, average lifetime in the 90s for a male was 72 and 78 for a female. It's double. It's now up to 10 years. The average lifespan for a male is 82, and it's now 88 for a female. Right, so it's even longer time frame, and we are supposed to retire at 65. Right, we're living 20 years after retirement. Back in the day, and even as late as the late 70s, your average lifespan was 70. Right, so 5 years after retirement, not 20 years after retirement. This is the dilemma that we have. I've
only got 180 grand in super. Well, if you only live 5 years, it's probably enough. But
correct,
if you live for 20 years, you're in big trouble. And if that Brian Johnson life extension bloke has his way, I mean, his science will feed its way into everything and everybody, and we'll probably add another 10 by the time you and I have kicked the bucket.
Which is also why retirement age already you're seeing is being pushed up to 67. By the time you and I get to retirement age, I would argue it's going to be 70. And there will be, and it's already starting shines, both for lifestyle and for other reasons, that there are people that will never retire because A, they don't want to, or B, more likely, they can't afford to. Now, super, and we'll come to super. Super is a very interesting discussion because it's one of the best policies Australia's ever put into place. It's just, at the moment, used very poorly. And it comes back to a big behavioural problem, which is you are told through your entire working life that to save for retirement. You build up this incredible nest egg, whether you put property into it or not, doesn't matter. And then one day you retire. Oh, by the way, now spend it. What? You want me to? You want me to actually spend all of this savings that I have? I could run out of money, but the innate human being, as I talked about before, is loss. They see it as a loss. Spending your money is a loss. And it's literally like telling you to cut off your left arm because you're
cannibalizing yourself.
Yeah, your whole habit-driven behavior around your money is to grow your superannuation. And you don't want to most people will tell you straight out the capital in it, maybe not the income, but the capital in it. They get really angry when you tell them you have to touch it. Really angry. I had one gentleman, and I won't say much more than this, but this one gentleman came up to me after I basically said, you guys need to actually draw on your super harder than you are. If you have more than $500,000 in super and you're pulling a pension, you should be thrown in jail. Now, it wasn't that dramatic, but I was sort of saying it to them. This guy absolutely went me. He said, "You have no idea how we live." I said, "Sir, how many on just figures, numbered, like how much do you have in super? 6 figures, 7 figures, or more?" "Oh, I've got 8 figures."
Oh, right.
And I just went, "Then no offense to you, don't come and yell at me, because your superannuation is not a wealth transfer to your kids. It's not an intergenerational wealth transfer. It's not what it's for. It's for you to stop living off the government and have the comfortable retirement that you deserve. You've got an 8-figure superannuation fund. How are you not having a retirement that is absolutely 5 stars? You're coming here and yelling at me for telling you to stop using a pension."
Yeah.
Like, and this is what's been lost in it. But again, comes all the way back into it. The behavior that he has learnt is to accumulate. And it will never change. Well, life changes. Life's not linear. So that's all part of this discussion as well, is that life is not linear, and you cannot think of your money and your economics as linear either. And your kids will be fine. Your retirement is your retirement. Your superannuation is for you, not for them. Use it.
Yeah, I like that. I want to ask you about the situation we're in at the moment with housing, but just starting from more of a macro view, where are we at the moment, and what is the trajectory? I mean, I've seen you on the telly talking about our per capita recession. We've got the Australian dollar in the toilet compared to the US, which is making people nervous about interest rate cuts, despite us having, like 3/4 sort of priced in at the next meeting. We saw wage price growth spike to like 25-year highs, and then it's kind of tapered down. We're still in a environment where productivity is very, very low, despite this AI revolution. People are sort of saying it's going to 10x the industrial revolution in terms of productivity. Hasn't eventuated yet. Where are we at? Is it positive, negative, and what does it look like for the future, and how does that sort of funnel into property? There's about 18 questions in there.
The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
That's a lot. Okay, so what have I got? I got half an hour. That's 18 questions. Yep. Okay. First way to look at this, COVID is I use as the base. 2020 showed how malleable and how diverse and how aspirational and moving we can be as a group of people, right? So we had a hardship put in front of us. Our adaptation was astonishing. Like how we adapted to that. How we've adapted to the current scenario is just as fascinating. We hear about the cost of living crisis, and that was part of sort of roughly one of your questions. Cost of living crisis has been going for 28 months, right? 28 months.
Yep.
And we haven't seen property fall off a cliff. We haven't seen the mortgage cliff. We haven't seen household strain that we saw in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s during recessions. Yep. And that was part of your questions about per capita GDP, issues.
Yep.
So the reason I want to start there, despite all the doom and gloom, there is a positiveness to what's happening. And again, it answers what I've sort of been saying before. Time doesn't stop. And because we know time doesn't stop, we just adapt. Now, we're not doing things like we were in the 10s, so 2010 through to 2019. Let's probably even go that far. And that annoys us. And that's what we're telling ourselves in the surveys, that we're, the household's constrained. I can't do what I want like I used to, et cetera, et cetera. Prices are really expensive. That's true. But if you actually look at things like spending and on what we're spending, that's really telling. So in the post-COVID world, people have realized that experiences are really important to them because we had experiences taken away. Last year, of all years, 13 interest rate rises that we've had, cost of living crisis and inflation pressures that we've had, overseas travel was insane in terms of how much we spent. Now, let's talk about the dollar because that feeds into it well. Where was the number one destination for Australians last year? Japan. Why was Japan one of the number one destinations? It was at a 30-year low to the Aussie dollar, the Japanese yen. It has never been cheaper to go to Japan. Now, the Aussie Japanese yen has now dropped 10%, but it's still 20% better than it was 13, 14 months ago. So there's pros and cons to everything in terms of this space. The Aussie dollar being where it is against the US dollar, 61, 62 US cents. I'll come back to the pressure on the RBA in a sec. Okay, yep, going to the US is going to be more expensive for you, and US goods will appear more expensive. But from a country perspective, it's great. Our exports, most of them are denoted in US dollars. So when you repatriate that back, more revenue for the same product offered. Mm-hmm. Government taxation, better, because all of a sudden that revenue transfer back into Aussie dollars means the tax take they get, particularly from our big miners and our overseas exporters, is better. We may actually get a third surplus off the back of what's going on with the currency. Yep. RBA and the currency. They don't look at the Aussie US dollar pair alone. They look at what we refer to as a trade-weighted index, which is 18 currencies across the globe. They've added in the Swiss franc. I can't believe it wasn't there before, but it's now been added in, so 19. And they then weight them accordingly to our trade. Mm-hmm. So clearly, the Chinese renminbi is the biggest, and it's at 29%. This is where the RBA is a little bit concerned because the Chinese government at the moment is what I refer to sandbagging itself against the upcoming Trump administration 2.0. So it's devaluing its currency. It's starting to spread money out. It's trying to expand. It learnt this from Trump 1.0, that the way to deal with tariffs is to make its goods appear almost exactly the same price with the tariffs included to US consumers. Yep. But we are a proxy for China. So if they devalue their currency, it makes up a third of that trade-weighted basket. The currency falls. The trade-weighted index is down at the moment. That can create imported inflation. Mm-hmm. I'm not worried if it happens for a couple of weeks or even if it happens for a couple of months. The RBA would be worried if by June you and I were having this conversation and it's still at the current levels. That would be a problem. And the RBA would then look at it. But all things being equal, if you look at the inflation data and what's going on in the inflation data, it's not an international story. It doesn't involve the currency. It's a domestic story. It's our demand. It's the demand for domestic products, what we refer to as intangible or non-tradable products. So non-tradables are products that you can only get and done in the country of origin. So for us in Australia, government services, education, health, housing, right? These three things, they've been humming along for almost 3.5 years at about 4 to 7%. They're the problem in the inflation story. They're finally easing off. Housing's the one to really watch, particularly around rents. And that's why they will cut rates this year. It's just when. Yep. Now, my argument would be at the moment they don't have enough data. You and I are doing this in, mid-January. So we have to wait to the 29th of Jan to get the final quarter of last calendar year's inflation data. Everybody's waiting for that because it's not perfectly binary, but it's close enough to a yes or no answer of whether or not they go on the 17th and 18th of Feb. Mm-hmm. If trim mean inflation, in my view, isn't at about 3.2%, which looking at the monthly data from October, November, December, we'll have to do something staggering to do that. They won't cut in February.
Right, okay.
But in May, they'll get the first quarter of this calendar year, and it's likely to be there by then. And so May for me is why I would argue that's when they'll start. And when they start, they're more likely to do several, not one. Because quarter of 1% rate cut, it's nice, doesn't really move the dial. So they'll need to start moving the dial because, as you said, part of your other 18 questions was GDP per capita. It's up to 7 quarters of negative growth. There's no signs it's going to break out in the final quarter. It will be 8 quarters of negative growth. That needs to change. Let me take a breath.
It was my fault, really. I mean,
No.
It's not a great style. Like Parkinson never did this.
So the final part of that question is the great conundrum is productivity. Mm-hmm. And this is something that at the moment I've been grappling with, actually not just right now, but for the last 13, 14 months. How to explain it, because I think that what's lost around productivity it has a connotation that is work more for less. That's not what it is. The argument is work efficiently.
Or generate more value. Is that another way to put it?
Yeah. And so the catch that comes with that, well, what and how does that mean? Particularly for an economy like Australia, which is that we are still majority a services-based economy, despite us being really good at digging holes in the ground or what have you. We are a service-based economy. And so service productivity is really hard to measure. And that's the first part of that answer. It's really hard to measure. ChatGPT is part of that. So if you look at law, let's look at that as a service, right? Because that's a really good start point. Law is one area that we know will be able to generate much, much more submission documents with ChatGPT AI technology than it was just as a single person writing them out themselves.
Yep.
That's more productive. That's more efficient. So that's where AI will fit into that conundrum. The other thing that we have a problem with at the moment is what is very fluffily, lovely described as the care economy. Now, the care economy is a good thing. It really is. Personally, it's at-home care, nursing, medical, childcare, all these personal things. They're great, absolutely essential. They are one of the highest hiring markets in Australia. It's part of the reason why our unemployment rate and our employment scenario is so strong. The care economy is doing it. The catch with the care economy is that it doesn't actually have a GDP output.
Right.
It's not a service that we're consuming. It's supported by government. And it doesn't...
Hugely supported too. I mean, that's obviously going to be a political hot potato in the upcoming election because as a percentage of spend, it's huge, right?
It's huge.
The NDIS.
Yeah. And that's the care economy, poster child is the NDIS. And the inefficiencies inside of it, which we are now being told left, right and centre by anybody who wants to tell you about the inefficiencies inside the NDIS, the cost growth in it is astonishing. The collapse of it's also quite large, blah, blah, blah. That is where that question comes, is that until we can get away from having more people in the care economy and back into output economy, let's call it that.
Yeah.
You probably won't pull out of the recession. The catch, and I will say this very clearly, from pure economics, the measurements aren't done well. From a behavior perspective and from a futurist perspective, the care economy is part of the future. It's more about how do we actually not just measure it, but actually can create value from it. Yes. Can we export it? Can we actually export care economy? Yeah, we can. I mean, look at how we export education. We are seen as one of the best education providers out there on the planet. That's an export. Australia has that as, say, our fourth largest export.
Right.
Care economy is the next export. How do we export the services that we offer in childcare or in NDIS to the world and start making money from it?
That is a challenge. That's probably a whole nother episode, though.
Yeah, it is. And we're going away from what we're talking about here. Sorry.
No, that's all right. So given what you've sort of just shared with us, let's get to the housing situation that we're in and perhaps the housing crisis, which is probably better described as a rental affordability crisis. Now, if you look back pre-COVID, one of my mentors and friends, Peter Kalisos, who's the Masters of Property convener at Adelaide Uni and former chair of PIPA, he actually looked at rent growth over a 25-year period and found that it didn't outpace inflation. So typically rents don't do much. They're very slow growing and fairly consistent. However, during the pandemic, we saw a huge increase in vacancy rates, which is weird to talk about because we're in a national vacancy sort of rate crisis. But we saw double-digit vacancy rates in inner city Melbourne and places like that. But then on the back end of that, we saw a huge increase in rents, double-digit growth in rents. And I mean, even Perth, which has come way off the peak, is still sitting at 8% growth, which is not super sustainable. We are sort of seeing changes in behaviour where the household formation rate is probably likely to change because people are joining together because, people can only afford so much. But how do you see us having got into that situation and what do you see as the trajectory for that?
So in the short term, it's going to be hard to rectify. I think that needs to be made pretty clear. the supply of investment and rental property market options is still quite low in terms of what's happening. You've also then, again, we've talked about public policy and where the public policy sits on it. It's been quite restrictive and forced, particularly in Victoria, for example, it's enforcing investors out and out. Now that, whether you agree with property investment and negative gearing and all that, put that to one side, it is a supplier of actual rentable property. So that's the first one that is there. The second one is supply. Again, the construction of properties that people want, the construction at an affordable price, and the types of properties being offered is also probably being caught up in politics. It's been caught up in the changes from COVID. They are going to come on soon enough, though. So you can already start to see that the supply of apartments particularly will really start to ramp up probably at the end of this year over the next 5 years. So, apartment living and apartment complex offerings will go through, which will alleviate some of it. But again, it's not the full answer to the whole thing because, if you look at per square meter build costs for these apartments, they're actually now probably in negative territory. Like a lot of them are costing sort of 900, per square meter for a 30, 40 square meter property. Back in the day, it would have cost you about 400, and the rents therefore have got a negative yield. Again, that's not what we're here to talk about. So the rental normality will happen. Okay, it will slowly but surely, but it won't alleviate like I think some people are talking about, because the other part of it comes back to what I spoke about before with the demand for purchasing of houses. The demand for rents in the areas the rents are going through the roof hasn't changed. Again, we like to work where we live. Most of the rents also come down to the universities. Universities' rental properties are part of it. It's why the government has now brought in this ludicrous idea of capping, immigration, because it's the whole concept. The thing about it is that it's transient, right? People come to university, they tend to go home.
Yep.
If they don't go home, they tend to go out to the regions. That's also a good thing. So the policy is wrong, in my view.
You're talking about the capping international students rather than just the international migration tempering? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Wrong way of doing it. It should have been tempering, full migration, or it should have been redirecting migration. As I said to you, we have this massive divide between urban and rural areas. We do it already, which is basically if you want to get permanent residency, you need to go and spend 1 to 2 years, depending on which state you're in, out in the regions.
Go to Dubbo or Albury or something.
Start there.
Yeah.
Start there. In terms of pushing people out into the regions, it will be a much better option in terms of where we sit. So that will start to particularly assist, the fact that rental rate vacancies in Victoria, New South Wales are the lowest level they've ever been. You can do that way, make incentives for people to actually go to the regions, start bringing Australia into the rest of the westernised developed world of not having to live in the cities. We saw during COVID that it happened. We got an explosion in the regions and then it's disappeared as people have come back to the cities. So that the way I would also look at it is work hubs and hubs of infrastructure spending hubs. If you want to help the regions and you're a government, don't try and build houses, right? That's my argument. Build the hubs that will bring people to that area, right? Rather than this, because that's where infrastructure can help, rather than doing what's happening in Victoria around building a suburban rail loop underneath a fully developed part of Melbourne. Why not build train links to the regions that are growing? You look at Ballarat, third largest city in Victoria. You look at what's going out in more northern and western Victoria as well. That's where you want to push people towards. New South Wales, not just going to Wollongong, keep going lower, right? Head towards Bega. Why not? Like the city to look at immediately is southeast, Queensland. Yep. They did it right? The Gold Coast to the Sunshine Coast is now linked. It's 150 kilometre space that is now linked with proper infrastructure, hubs that drive people to the Gold Coast, despite the weather and the lifestyle. But there's actual infrastructure and opportunity that people want to be in. So
why haven't we done it in a way that say, other countries that you could argue are far more established, like Japan, right? Like that's an old country, yet it's like the gold standard for high-speed rail. I mean, I saw just this morning
Cost
on my
analysis,
Facebook
right?
feed. Yeah, right.
Cost analysis. Again, the issue comes down to 27 million people in a country that's the 6th largest landmass on the planet. Japan, Tokyo is the largest populated city on the planet, something like 45 million people in Greater Tokyo. And in a country that is basically the extension from, central New South Wales down to the bottom of Victoria. So
it's not that big, is it?
It's not that big, but with a huge, incredible population. The other thing that's not big about it is that it's beautiful, fauna and fauna are a mountain range in the middle of the island. And so that also pushes people to the coast. So you've got a dense area as well. And so I absolutely love your point and pick it up. This discussion about high-speed rail in Australia, when you actually boil it down to dollar and cents of building a high-speed rail, it doesn't stack up, unfortunately. That's you look at what's happened in aviation, and unfortunately, players like what's going on with Bonza and what's going on with Rex and what have you. That also, again, is why it's so hard to do it. But again, the government option is build the infrastructure. More than that, build the business hubs to drive people there. Gladstone's a great example, right? You look at what's going on. It's going through a bit of a pressure now, but those hubs, Townsville, great example as well. They have many different business hubs driving into Townsville, and it's a fascinating city to look at because it's got tourism, it's got services, it's got agriculture, it's also got manufacturing.
So if we can't build the high-speed rail, is the magic formula is to build the hub, but it has to be significant enough that people don't need to commute somewhere else. So Townsville, if you move to Townsville, you can reasonably find a job, right? You've got all the amenities. You've got, Ethiopian takeaway. That's always my measure. Like if a location has Ethiopian takeaway, it's made it, right? You don't need to go anywhere else.
So and that's a perfect way of looking. So you look at New South Wales Central Coast, right? So you look at a Newcastle, Port Macquarie, Coffs, etc. It's got some form of hub that drives people there. Now, even if you look at Byron, it's not a great example, but even that has a, beside being a resort town and a hub for high-end celebrities, there is a drive to it. Right. Yep. And there is a job to be had, or at least a career progression that's to be had all the way up there. There is some form of train service that goes through those hubs. Victoria's sort of done it, not as well. I mean, you look at the westification of Victoria, particularly with Melbourne, Geelong in the next 20 years will touch Melbourne. I mean, if it hasn't already. And you look at a Werribee, you look at a Lara and those kinds of suburbs, that sort of Princes Highway connect is happening, and more businesses are realizing to be there and be out there. People can get the lifestyle that they've always wanted. Getting back to government, infrastructure means more than just building a road or a train. Infrastructure is building a hospital, an education hub, university, and schooling. Build those things, people will come. Right. The private investment in housing will come. And that gets back to the whole discussion about, renting. If you can take pressure off the city hub problem, because that's also what it is. I mean, again, all of what I just said is so hard from the behavioural economic side that really gets annoying is that, unfortunately, you can't recreate inner city Melbourne culture with a click of your fingers. You can't create the beach lifestyle you get in eastern Sydney with a click of your fingers because it doesn't exist if you put it in the middle of nowhere. So that's the argument. I can already hear people coming back listening to this will say, I can't do what I do in Sydney or Melbourne or Adelaide or whatever it is in Whyalla or Geelong or Wollongong. Yeah, true. But, and it's a really good but, the lifestyle long-term that you can have will be much more affordable to you than trying to make it in cities that are really squeezing people hard.
Yeah. If you want to spend 50% of your income on your housing, you have at it. But if you prefer a more meaningful or manageable 20 or 30, then you'd love this paddock we've just started breaking ground on.
I'm going to interrupt you there. So perfect point. That's the time thing again, right? What if you are moving to the regions, you've got to come to it from a mindset it might not be forever, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in your 20s are 5, 10, depending if you're 20 or 25 years away from your 30s and the start of your 30s, right? If you're moving there in your 30s, your 50s are 20 years away, right?
Yep.
Nothing's forever. And that's what I think is also lost on this debate, particularly for the younger generation. And I'm a millennial, put my hand up there. I'm at the early end of the millennials. I was an 80s baby, I'll put it that way, in that a lot of the millennials that I survey and that I speak to and I do with what I do wanted to buy their parents' house off the bat. And that sort of belief hasn't changed, unfortunately, right? They want to buy their parents off the bat in the area that they grew up in. Well, if you actually go and ask your parents, they probably started with the apartment in the crappy part of town and then bought the townhouse in the crappy part of town and then finally had enough money saved together with equity in the property that they had to then buy a house in the nice part of town that you possibly were born in before they bought the house that you now live in. Because if you listen to baby boomers and, the top end of Gen Xers, they have more likely over their lifetime owned a minimum of 5 properties.
Yeah.
That's what the data shows. It's a minimum of 5. Some of them are up to, double digits. Why would you expect to be able to live and buy what your parents had at the end off the bat? You just can't do that.
Well,
you build the wealth.
Outside of that, there's the income to asset price ratio, which I think is probably far more quoted than the point that you're making, but it's a combination of the both, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's all part of my world of behavior, right? Is actually going numbers on a spreadsheet mean nothing, right? It's the future behind the numbers that matter. That's basically the tagline that you need to say is that it's the future behind it. So the numbers today suggest that you need to do what your parents did, which is start in a different part of town or even start in a different town, right? Not the same town. And that's okay. The world experience you get from that, from a sociological perspective, is also something that should not be, barked at, because the experience, the learning capabilities that you'll get from that possibly will actually be higher than you are where you are now, because the demand for certain jobs will not have the same amount of supply of people. So a great example is if you're moving, again, let's use law as an example, to a regional town working in a law firm, you're likely to move faster up the chain quickly because there's not going to be as many supply of lawyers as there is if you're trying to do it in Sydney.
Yeah.
So the experience you get will rapidly be faster and better, possibly, than doing it the traditional way, starting in the big cities and away you go. A great example I'll give to you right now, I met a colleague at a wedding a couple of months back, and he was working at the RBA. He was working at the Reserve Bank as an economist. And in his early 20s, this opportunity came up to actually go and work at the Treasury Department in Vanuatu.
Right.
And he was in his 20s, and he ran with it. Yeah. He said, yeah, absolutely, because they were doing an exchange between the RBA and the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu. And he said within 2 years, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he was actually sitting on the board of the Vanuatu National Bank, setting interest rates at 27.
Wow.
Right. So this is the thing that you've got to think about. Everybody's looking at the opportunity loss, right? And let me put getting back to the sort of Daniel Kahneman thing. His biggest thing, what he won the Nobel Prize for, was loss aversion, which I'm sure you've heard before, Mike. But for those who haven't, loss aversion is that we are more geared to loss. So if you were to put your hand in your pocket that you thought had $100 in it and you couldn't find it, you will dwell on that for upwards of 2 weeks. Whereas if you didn't realize it was there, put your hand in, pull it out, and get that windfall, you'll love it for no more than about 12 hours. That's what the study found. And he did it a bit more than that, in the fact that we are much more willing to take risk to get back loss rather than take risks to make gain.
It's the gambling mindset, isn't it? Always chase your losses.
You always chase your losses, right? So you are much more geared to the fact that if I lost 10% of my portfolio, then if you would actually make 20%, net, you're 10% up. Oh, there's so many different ways to look at it. But that also feeds into everyday life. So your opportunity cost loss overrides the opportunity cost gain. So he went the other way. He saw the gain of going to Vanuatu, the life experience it would give him, but just by pure also, proximity, his opportunity career gain went through the roof. All right. As he said, my possibility of sitting on the RBA board would still not be happening, and this guy's now in his 40s.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And at 27, he sat on the board of a reserve bank across the globe.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time for today, but I would love to get
What a
you
ramble.
back.
Sorry, mate.
No, I love that. We've gone a huge deep dive, but I'd love to get you back to talk about how property investors can build an appreciation for all of the moving parts and pieces at play, and how a behavioural economist can help us to pre-identify areas of gentrification and growth, if you're up for that.
I would love to. I would
Beautiful.
love to do that. Mike, I will be there with bells on. I can't wait for it.
We'll tee that up. Thank you very much, Evan, for sharing all of that gold today. My head's spinning. I need to have a lie down and process it, but I'll be back with questions for the next one.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Cheers.